Greetings.
Part 3: The Lions. He went to Bloodhoof village in the autumn of his 16th year, 2 months before his 17th birthday, with his gun and his pack, and enough coin to pay for proper training, and the specific readiness of someone who has been preparing for a thing long enough that the preparation has become its own kind of impatience. Bloodhoof village sat at the southern edge of the great Mulgore plain in the sheltered hollow where the land curved toward the lake, a larger and more travelled settlement than Camp Narek, a crossroads for the region, hunters and craftspeople and traders passing through, in a volume that gave the village the sense of accumulated knowledge, as if the answers to many questions were findable here if you knew who to ask. The smell of the place was familiar, and not the same Mulgore base note of grass and cookfire and cured leather, but layered with more complexity, more populations of smell occupying the same air. He found Thotter outside a small tent near the bridge, sitting with the settled patience of someone who spent a great deal of time waiting for students to arrive, and had made his peace with the waiting. Thotter was broad and unhurried, with the particular stillness experienced hunters developed, not Khan's innate quiet, but the kind earned through practice, the understanding that patience was more efficient than urgency. He looked at Khan's gun with the assessing attention of a professional, and then looked at Khan himself with the same attention. "You have had instruction," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Khan said. "Braka Windtrail." Thotter nodded slowly, with the weight of someone recognizing a significant name. "Then we begin in the middle," he said, "which is better than beginning at the beginning." What Thotter gave him was the formal version of what Braka had given him by instinct, the precise vocabulary of the hunter's craft, understanding not just what worked but why, which let him adapt the technique to circumstances the road hadn't shown him, yet rather than only the ones he'd already learned it for. He taught Khan the formal understanding of distance and positioning, the geometry of engagement, how different weapons created different optimal spaces, and how to move between those spaces as the situation changed. He taught him the specific application of the gun in coordinated action with a companion, which Braka had introduced in its basic form, and which Thotter developed into something considerably more complete. He taught him the trap work, the specific craft of using the terrain as a tool, how to place a freezing trap so that it served the engagement rather than complicating it, how to combine the trap's effect with the gun's range, and the companion's close work into a coordinated sequence that was more than the sum of its parts. He taught him the formal feeding and tending of a companion animal, adding to the foundations Braka had given him the specific medical knowledge of the common injuries and ailments that companion animals encountered, and what could be done about each of them in the field. Khan stayed in Bloodhoof village for 9 days, working with Thotter each morning, and spending the afternoons in the practice that converted instruction into capability. He paid for the training with silver he had saved across 2 years of careful craft work, and the paying was itself a satisfaction. The direct connection between the work of the hands and the acquisition of the knowledge that made the hands more capable was a circuit that felt correct to him, a form of honesty about what things were worth and what they cost. On the 4th day, Thotter took him to Raban Freerunner. Raban worked from the same tent, smaller than its function implied, organized the way someone organizes a space that requires quick access to many different materials, tethers and mending supplies, and the specific feeds that different kinds of companion animals required, each in its designated place, with the organization of someone who had learned through experience that disorder in this work had consequences. He was younger than Thotter, still in the process of mastering what he taught rather than having arrived at the comfortable authority of complete mastery, and this gave his instruction a sense of genuine engagement that Khan found valuable. He was being taught by someone who still found the subject surprising. Raban's instruction was almost entirely practical. He taught Khan the signs of a companion animal's physical state, the gradations of health and distress visible in the coat and the eyes and the movement itself, each one communicating something if you knew the vocabulary. He taught him the mending of a companion's wounds in conditions where the animal was frightened, and in pain, and the trust between hunter and companion was the only thing that allowed the mending to happen, the specific management of your own state that made it possible for the animal to accept your hands on a wound, the approach and the touch and the patient waiting that preceded any intervention. He taught him the feeding too, what different animals needed nutritionally, what they preferred, and why the preference mattered beyond simple palatability. He had canned practice on 2 of the training animals he kept for this purpose: a young plainstrider that had been companion trained and was accustomed to handling, and a more recently acquired prairie wolf that was still in the early stages of the bond and required the kind of patient, careful approach that tested whether the student had genuinely understood what they had been told or merely heard it. Can worked with the prairie wolf for 2 full days, approaching and retreating with the patience of someone who understood that the animal's acceptance of proximity was the whole point and the goal, not something to be hurried past on the way to something else. On the 9th morning, Raban watched Can work with the prairie wolf and said, in the direct way of someone making an honest assessment, "You are going to be very good at this." He said it without flattery and without investment in how Can received it, which made it trustworthy. "The prairie wolf has been in this tent for 3 weeks, and you are the first student it has accepted feed from on the 2nd day. He paused. Most students take 5 or 6 days to reach that point. Some do not reach it at all. Can said nothing because the correct response was not a response. On the afternoon of his 9th day in Bloodhoof village, before he returned to Camp Narek for the farewell, he went east into the grasslands and tamed a wild prairie wolf for the first time. He had identified the animal 2 days before, a young male, moving in the grasslands east of the village with the angular, quick energy of a prairie wolf in full health, working a territory that was still being established rather than one that had been settled for years. He had watched for 2 days with the care Raban had taught him and Braca had developed in him, care that was, at its foundation, simply his most consistent capability, the thing he had always brought to anything worth watching. He spent an afternoon in the approach, the slow closing of distance that gave the animal time to register his presence and assess it, and reach a provisional conclusion that it did not require immediate flight. By evening, the prairie wolf was 10 yards away, and eating the feed he had placed on the ground between them, which was the specific evidence of the provisional conclusion. He slept that night in the grasslands rather than returning to the village, which maintained the continuity of presence that the relationship required in its earliest stage. By the following noon, the prairie wolf was moving with him. He spent a week with the animal in the Bloodhoof village area, working beside it, watching it, learning the vocabulary of its movement with the attention he gave to things worth understanding. The low-line approach, the use of momentum through rapid direction changes, the specific way the body stayed close to the ground through the tightest turns. He observed each element with the focused attention of someone building a translation dictionary rather than learning a single language, understanding that what he was acquiring was not the prairie wolf's technique, but the principle underneath it that a lion's body might one day express in its own terms. He wanted to tame a lion from the day he saw dusk. He released the prairie wolf on the 7th day, in the grasslands where he had found it, watching it disappear into the terrain with the straight-line confidence of an animal that had somewhere to be and no further reason to delay. He let himself feel the releasing rather than managing it, the particular weight of letting go of something that had given you something, which was different from simply ending a thing. Then he found and tamed a boar in the hill country north of the village, and spent 10 days with the boar learning the different vocabulary of a different kind of capability, the force management, the direct line engagement, the specific courage of an animal whose strategy was to be harder to stop than whatever was trying to stop it. He learned what he needed to learn and released the boar with the same directness with which he had released the prairie wolf, and then he walked back to Camp Narek, carrying what both animals had given him, and thinking about the lion he had not yet found, and what the translation might eventually look like. He told his mother the night before. Not asked, he was 17, and the decision had been building for 2 years with the slow, inexorable accumulation of things that could not be indefinitely deferred. But told, because she deserved to know before it happened rather than after, and because telling her was a form of respect that the asking would have undermined. He waited until the evening meal was done and the lamp was burning low, and the settlement had settled into its nighttime register, and he sat across the fire from her and said he was going north. That he intended to reach Thunder Bluff. That he did not know precisely how long it would take, or exactly what road he would walk between here and whatever came after. Sira listened without interrupting, looking at the fire rather than his face in the way she had when she was taking something seriously. The fire held still, unlike faces, which moved and could distract from the content of what was being said. When he finished, she let the silence sit for a moment. Then she got up and began packing. She worked in the methodical, unhurried way she brought to all practical tasks, moving through their dwelling with the assurance of someone who had organized the same space for years and knew, without looking, where everything was. Dried meat, dense and carefully prepared, wrapped in treated hide against moisture. A good skinning knife with a blade she had sharpened herself that morning. He did not ask how she had known, because the answer was simply that she had known, which was one of the consistent qualities of Sira Ashwallow that he had long since stopped finding remarkable. Clean bandaging cloth, more of it than he would have packed for himself, folded tight and wrapped in oiled linen. The resin preparations, each in its small clay container sealed with wax, labelled in her precise hand. A fire-starting kit. The leather map she had been adding to for months, annotated with water sources and settlement distances, and the specific notes of someone who had been asking travellers about the northern roads as casually as possible without wanting to explain why. She added a small pouch of coins. Not much. Enough for a meal and a night's shelter when the road made such things necessary. She set all of it at his feet without fuss, and then stood in front of him and took his face in her large hands. Her palms were warm from the fire and rough from decades of hide work, a texture distinct to that craft and unlike any other kind of labor, and they held his face with the care of someone who did not touch carelessly. She looked at his eyes, as she had always looked at his eyes when she had something important to say, as if the red in them were a more direct line to whatever he actually was beneath the surface of what she could see. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, reading something she had been reading for 17 years and had not yet finished understanding. Then she said, "Come back changed." Not lost. There is a difference. He knew she was not talking about direction. He held that distinction with him, the difference between being shaped by experience and being dissolved by it, and carried it the way he carried all things his mother had given him, not lightly and not as a burden, but as equipment. The kind of thing you reached for when you needed it. She stepped back. She looked at the packed supplies at his feet, and then at him with an expression that had something in it that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but contained elements of both and had arrived at a third thing that had no precise name. She said, "Eat well. Keep your first aid kit dry. Clean the gun after every use." He said, "I know." She said, "I know you know. I am saying it anyway." He went to sleep that night in the dwelling he had slept in every night of his life, listening to the sounds of Camp Narek settling into dark, the last voices at the communal fire, the wind moving through the settlement's structures at night, the distant sound of the river he had been visiting since before he could have named what a river was, and understood that this was the last night of a specific chapter of his life, and allowed himself to feel the weight of that without trying to manage it into something else. He was at the river before dawn. He had not decided to go early. He had woken in the grey dark with his mind already running and found that lying still was no longer useful, and had dressed and taken his packed gear and gone to the place he had always gone when the world required thinking. He sat on his stone in the cool dark and listened to the water and watched the sky begin its slow transformation above the eastern hills, and he was not surprised when he heard Tamer's footstep on the bank behind him, because Tamer had always found him when it mattered, with the reliability of someone who paid sufficient attention to know where to look. She sat beside him without preamble. She was wrapped in a blanket against the pre-dawn cool, and she had been crying at some point recently, which she made no attempt to conceal because Tamer did not conceal things as a general practice, and she sat with the packed solidity of someone who had come with something to say and intended to say it. They sat for a while without speaking. The river ran. The sky moved through its colours. Then she said, "You will ask about your father on the road." It was not a question. She knew him well enough that very few of the significant things about him required phrasing as questions. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, with the tamer conviction that said this was the correct and necessary thing, and she had already decided to support it. "You have been carrying that question for too long without trying to answer it. The road will give you angles that the settlement never could." He said, "I do not know what I will find." No, she said. But you will know more than you know now, which is worth whatever the finding costs. He looked at the water. The light was coming slowly, the sky above the eastern hills going from deep blue to the luminous grey that preceded dawn. A fish moved in the shallows 20 yards upstream, the surface marking its passage with a brief disturbance that smoothed immediately. Tamer held still for a moment. Then she said, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the decision can be reversed, "I need to tell you something." She paused and then said, "I am going to say it and then I am going to release you from it, so do not be afraid of the saying." He looked at her. She was looking at the river, her jaw set with the specific expression she wore when she was doing something that required more courage than she usually needed for ordinary things. The blanket was wrapped tight around her shoulders and her hands were visible at the edge of it, and the hands were not entirely still. She said, "I love you. I have loved you for years, and I am not going to pretend I did not, because pretending true things are not true is something I cannot do." She said it plainly. At the same volume she said everything, without decoration and without apology. "And I am not telling you this to make you stay, or to make you feel something you do not feel, or to make the going harder than it already is. I am telling you because not telling you would be a kind of dishonesty, and I cannot leave you with a dishonesty between us." She stopped. The river ran. The sky moved. She said, "You do not have to say anything. I mean that honestly and not in the way people mean it when they say it, and need you to say something anyway. You do not have to say anything." He looked at her face in the early light, the set jaw and the eyes that were holding very steady on the river and the hands that were not entirely still. And he felt the full weight of what she had said landing in him, the way real things land, without softening and without the management that would have reduced it to something more comfortable to carry. He felt it land and he let it land, and he sat with it the way she had said he could sit with it, without performing a response for the sake of filling the space she had left. He opened his mouth and found that the words he had for this were insufficient, that everything that came to mind was either too small or too large or somehow beside the point, and that none of it would do what he needed it to do, which was honor what she had said with equal honesty and equal courage. He said her name. Just that. Tamer. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time since she had sat down, and something in her face changed, not relaxed, not satisfied, but shifted into something simultaneously sad and resolved. "That is enough," she said. And she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. They sat together until the sun cleared the eastern hills, and the river was fully lit, and the fish had moved into their morning positions, and neither of them said anything more about what had been said, because everything had been said that needed saying, and anything more would have been diminishment. Then Tamer stood up and straightened her blanket, and looked at him with the direct brown eyes that had been looking at him with total honesty for 8 years, and she said, "Go now, before the camp is fully awake. You know how they are about farewells." He did know. Camp Narek was warm and loud about the things it cared about, and a farewell to someone it had watched grow up would be warm and loud and long, and he would be standing there receiving it when what he needed was to be moving. He stood and shouldered his pack and picked up his gun and looked at her one more time. She was already looking at the river, the blanket around her shoulders, her feet tucked up under her on the stone, in the position she had been sitting in at this river since she was 7 years old. She was not watching him go because she had decided not to watch him go, which he understood was its own form of consideration. He walked north through Camp Narek in the early light, past the communal fire, cold now and grey-ashed from the night, past the leatherworking spaces where the morning's work had not yet begun, the tools laid out and waiting, past the fishing racks and the cooking area and Musapor's dwelling from which the smell of the old shaman's morning incense was already drifting, past the totem poles with their carved ancestors, watching the living with the calm of the long resolved. At the northern edge of the settlement's grazing land he stopped. He had told himself he would not look back, and then he allowed himself to revise that, because the telling himself was a performance of not needing, and he was beyond that kind of performance now. He turned and looked at Camp Narek in the morning light, the smoke beginning to rise from the first fires being lit, the red stone formations behind the settlement catching the first warmth, the settlement going about its beginning in all the ordinary ways that things began when no one was watching the beginning particularly. He looked for perhaps a minute. He fixed it in the specific way you fix things, when you understood you were leaving rather than merely departing. Then he turned north and walked, and did not look back again. The road north through Mulgore was not a road in the engineered sense, but a path worn into the grass by the passage of generations, wide enough for two travellers side by side, marked at intervals by stacked stones, whose placement communicated directions to those who knew the language of their arrangement. Can walked it slowly, by which he meant at the pace that allowed him to actually inhabit what he was moving through, not the pace of someone trying to arrive somewhere, but the pace of someone who understood that the moving was itself the point, and that what happened between the leaving and the arriving was where most of the real things were. He practiced the gun in the mornings before the settlements he passed were fully awake, in the open country where the shots would not alarm anyone. A flat section of grassland backed by a stone formation, the target set against the stone, the sequence of loading and aiming and breathing and firing becoming incrementally more consistent with the intention behind it. The gun had been learning his hands for 2 years, and the education was not complete, but was far enough along that he could trust it in the basic sense. He could usually put the shot where he meant it to go, which was not the same as always but was sufficient for the stage he was at. He skinned the animals the road offered with the technique his mother had given him and Braca had refined, finding that his hands had absorbed more than he had consciously catalogued, that the work came with a confidence that had not been there at the beginning of the 2 years, and was now simply present, the confidence of something that had been repeated until it was genuinely known. He cooked from what the land provided, applying Roque's principles to the specific ingredients available, finding that the principles held across the variation of materials in the way that genuine principles held, not as recipes but as understanding, which was more flexible and more useful. He fished the rivers he crossed in the mornings and evenings, and the water of the northern road spoke a slightly different dialect than the water near Camp Narek, shallower in some places, deeper and colder in others, with different species holding different positions. He added this vocabulary to what he already had with the quiet pleasure of someone who genuinely enjoyed the accumulation of specific knowledge. He slept under the open sky when the weather permitted, which in early spring meant accepting that it sometimes did not. On those nights he found shelter in the overhangs of the stone formations. The red rock country of southern Mulgore was generous with these, the formations large enough and shaped in ways that offered genuine protection from wind and rain, if you read the terrain correctly. He lay in the dark listening to the rain on stone and thought about Tamer's voice saying what it had said at the river, and the way her face looked in the early light, and the meaning of the distinction between the saying and the asking, and was grateful for both. He asked about his father at the first settlement he passed through. The settlement was small, a dozen families, a communal fire, the specific smell of a Mulgore craftspeople's community that was immediately familiar and immediately not home. He traded a cured hide for a meal and a night's space near the fire, and asked his question with the plain directness he had developed for it, the question stripped of urgency and performance. A Tauran scout named Duro Ashwallow Bloodhoof clan, perhaps 15 years ago, heading east toward the crossroads, carrying dispatches. Lean, quiet, a scar above the left eyebrow from an old wound, carrying a shorter bow than was standard for a scout his size. Nothing. The people at this fire were too young to have been adults 15 years ago, and the names of elders who might have remembered yielded nothing useful. One had died 3 winters back, one had moved to a larger settlement to the north, one was old enough to have remembered but had not, and said so with the honest shrug of someone who had seen many travellers at many fires and had not catalogued them all. Can thanked them, accepted the information as what it was, which was data of a specific kind, the kind that told you where the answer was not, and continued north in the morning. At the second settlement, 3 days later, he found Grasswind. He was an older hunter, 60 if he was a day, built with the specific density of someone who had spent decades in physical work that had compressed and settled everything rather than building it up. His face was a record of those decades, deeply weathered, the eyes set in the permanent slight squint of someone who had spent too many years reading terrain in bright light. He was sitting at the settlement's communal fire with the settled ease of a person in their preferred position in the world, and he looked at Can, when Can sat down with the assessing attention of an experienced hunter encountering something that warranted an honest read. Can asked his question. Grasswind paused for a moment, as if accessing memory rather than formulating a response. Then he said, "A scout. Heading east. I remember a scout." Can held still. About that time, Grasswind said, "Could be more, could be less. 15 years is approximately right. He stopped here one night. Ate at this fire. He was heading for the crossroads, said he was carrying dispatches east, arranging mission of some kind." He paused again, looking at the fire with the expression of someone watching an old image come clearer. Cheerful, competent seeming, in the way of someone who has been doing difficult work for long enough that it no longer looks difficult. He ate and slept and continued east in the morning. I did not see him again. Can said, "Did he mention where east?" "Anything beyond the crossroads." Grasswind shook his head slowly. The crossroads was as specific as he got. He said he expected to be back within a season. He said it the way you say something you believe is true and has not yet been tested by events. Can looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Grasswind looked at him with the direct attention of an experienced person reading a younger one. He said, "This is family." "Yes," Can said. Grasswind nodded slowly, with the weight of someone who understood what that meant for the asker and was not going to diminish it with unnecessary commentary. He said, "If I remember anything else, I will pass it along." "Tell me where you are going." Can said, "Thunder Bluff first. Then wherever the road goes." Grasswind nodded again. He said, "The crossroads is the kind of place where things are remembered if you ask the right people. There are hunters there who have been working that territory for 30 years. If a scout passed through heading east 15 years ago and something happened to him, someone in the crossroads knows something about it." Can stored this alongside the other piece. The direction confirmed, the destination named, the timeline consistent. It was not much. It was more than he had left Camp Narake with. He thanked Grasswind with the genuine directness he brought to all gratitude and continued north in the morning. And the crossroads went into the list of places he needed to visit with the same care he gave to water sources and weapon masters. Necessary, marked, to be reached in time. 3 days north of the second settlement, deep in the Red Rock country, where the formations grew large enough to create genuine corridors, and the light between them had a different character than open plain light, caught and redirected by the stone faces. Warm and specific in ways that made the ordinary world look briefly like something that had been arranged rather than grown. He smelled the kill. He was moving with the wind at his right side, which he had been doing without conscious direction since early in the day, adjusting his route incrementally to maintain the useful angle. The smell arrived on a shift in the current, unmistakable to anyone who had spent sufficient time in terrain where things killed and were killed. The copper-iron depth of fresh blood, the heavier note underneath it of opened viscera, the specific richness of something large that had been alive within the hour and was not anymore. Not old death with its different chemistry. Recent, close, and made by something powerful. The quantity of the smell spoke to a single decisive event rather than the messier evidence of a prolonged struggle. He stopped. He stood completely still and read the silence around him, which was not silence but the specific subtraction of certain sounds that should have been present. The grass insects in the middle distance, still audible. The small birds in the lower scrub ahead, present in the outer range, absent in an oval of perhaps 60 yards centered on something ahead and to his left. Not frightened away in the way prey animals frightened them. Simply relocated, with the unhurried pragmatism of small things that had determined something large was nearby, and had moved to appropriate distance without drama. He unslung his gun, loaded it with the deliberate sequence Braca had taught him, and moved off the path on the downwind side, through the grass, circling. Not stalking, he had no hostile intention, but approaching in the way that gave him the most information before he committed to a position. He found the Plainstrider in a shallow depression between two formations. It was a large adult male, on its side, the utter stillness of recent death. The kill was a single bite to the back of the neck, precisely placed, the predator's knowledge of exactly where to apply force for maximum efficiency and minimum struggle. The wound was not ragged, it was specific. The body was still warm, the blood not yet dried at the edges, steam barely perceptible where the opened cavity met the cool spring air. Minutes, perhaps less than he had estimated. He crouched beside it and looked at the bite for a moment with the attention he gave to things that told him about their maker. The spacing of the marks, the depth, the precise location. Then he looked up at the ridge above the depression. Even at 40 yards, even across the open space of the depression and the slope of the ridge, even before he had resolved any of the details, the specific coat color, the mane, the face, the animal was remarkable in a way that hit him physically before his mind had processed the components. He was large. Not large in the way of large animals Can had seen before, not quantitatively larger, subject to comparison and placement on a scale. Large in a way that seemed to indicate a different category, as if the word large did not accurately describe what was happening, but was the closest available approximation. The body was long and deep-chested, the shoulders substantial in a way that communicated power not as a potential, but as a current fact, the legs proportioned with the specific geometry of something built to cover terrain at speed and to hold position against significant resistance. His coat was the deep warm tawny of old honey at the peak of the season, smooth and dense and carrying the sheen, not the dull flat coat of an animal under stress or in inadequate condition, but the full living sheen of something in genuine, uncompromised health. His mane was full and dark, shading from amber at the outer edges to near black at the center where it was densest, and it framed a face that was broad and level and absolutely, completely calm. He had no scars. Can looked for them with the assessing attention he gave to significant things, and found none, not a notch in the ears, not a mark on the muzzle, not the kind of accumulated physical record that large predators in competitive territory typically wore somewhere on their bodies by the time they reached full authority. This was not the coat of an animal that had been lucky enough to avoid damage. It was the coat of an animal that had engaged with whatever had challenged it, and had ended those engagements in ways that left no marks on him. There was a significant difference between those two things, and the difference was visible in how he held himself, with the complete, unforced ease of a creature that had never had occasion to be anything less than entirely itself. He was watching the plain below the ridge with the settled, proprietary attention of something that had established its relationship with this territory so completely that watching it was not vigilance but possession. This was his ridge, his plain, his red rock country. He watched it the way a craftsperson watched their own work, with the pleasure of familiarity and the confidence that comes from having made something entirely yours. He was, Can thought, the most complete thing he had ever seen. He sat down in the grass 30 yards from the base of the ridge, below the lion's direct line of sight but not hidden. Hiding had not entered his thinking, because hiding would have been a misrepresentation of his intentions, and he had decided, in the moment he crouched by the plainstrider and looked up at the ridge, that he would be exactly what he was. He set his gun across his knees and looked at the lion and waited. The light moved through its afternoon work on the stone formations, the shadows lengthening, the warmth shifting as the sun descended toward the western plain. Can ate one of the dried meat strips his mother had packed without taking his eyes from the ridge. He was cold in the way of someone who has been sitting still in spring air for several hours and has become accustomed to the cold, which was different from not being cold. The lion knew he was there. He understood this within the first few minutes, with the certainty that came not from evidence he could point to but from the lion's stillness itself, which had a different character than simple unawareness. An unaware animal was still in a direct way present in itself, attending to its own moment, with no portion of its awareness allocated elsewhere. This stillness had a subtle directionality to it, a faint orientation that was consistent with having assessed the thing in the grass below the ridge and made a decision about it. The lion was aware. He had looked at what was there. He had decided it was not a threat and not interesting enough to address directly, and had returned his attention to the plain. It was, Can thought, the most complete social dismissal he had ever experienced. It pressed against him in a way that was not unpleasant, not threatening, not hostile, but was unmistakably a statement. He existed in the lion's awareness in the category of things that were present and had been assessed and found neither dangerous nor relevant. He found this somehow one of the most interesting things that had ever happened to him. To be looked at by something of that completeness and found accessible, to be worth the assessment, even if the result of the assessment was a return to prior business, felt like a beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. He came back the next morning before dawn. The mornings that followed established a practice that was not routine. Routine suggested mechanism, the absence of engagement, but was rather a sustained and genuine form of attention applied consistently to the same subject across time. He came each morning to the same position, 30 yards, below the ridge's direct sightline, deliberately visible, making no adjustment to reduce his presence or increase his apparent harmlessness. He brought nothing. He offered nothing. He sat in a stillness that was his fundamental nature, and watched the lion with the same attention he gave to things he genuinely wanted to understand. He watched the lion move through the red rock country on the days when he left the ridge, the specific way he placed his paws on different terrain, the subtle shifts in his body that preceded changes of direction, the way he used the stone formations as windbreaks and observation points, the difference in his movement when he was hunting versus when he was simply moving through territory. He watched when the lion fed and when he rested and what specific configurations of behavior preceded each. He watched the ears, their angle communicating things he was building a vocabulary for, and the tail and the breathing and the way the whole body was held at different moments. He was, in these days, not trying to befriend the lion. He was not trying to do anything in the instrumental sense. He was simply paying the kind of attention that caused things to reveal themselves to the most remarkable animal he had ever encountered, in the hope that if he was patient enough and present enough and honest enough about what he actually was, the revelation might eventually include him. On the third morning, the lion turned his great head and looked directly at Can. Not a glance, not the brief orientation of an animal checking a known position. A look full, unhurried, complete, the amber eyes holding him with the focused attention of something making a genuine assessment of something it considered worth assessing. The gaze had weight. It pressed against him in a way that was not threatening, but was not neutral. It was the look of a creature deciding something about you, taking the time the deciding required, with no interest in making the process comfortable for the thing being decided about. Can held very still. He did not perform anything, not submission, not approach, not any gesture toward communication. He was there as fully and honestly as he knew how to be, and allowed himself to be seen as whatever he actually was without managing the seeing. The assessment lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the lion turned his head back to the plain below and resumed his watching, and the world continued. Can sat in the grass and felt the 30 seconds sitting in him, and understood that something had changed in the category of his assessment, that he had moved from not threat, not interesting to something that did not have a clean name, but was neither of those things anymore. He went to sleep that night with the 30 seconds still in him, woke with them still there, and carried them back to the ridge the next morning. The kind of weight that meant a thing held more than its surface had shown him. The days accumulated with the patience of the practice. By the end of the first week, the lion's stillness had changed in a way that Can could not have described precisely, but could feel in the space between them. The directed alertness, the subtle orientation that had characterized the lion's awareness of Can in the first days, was reducing, being replaced by the incorporation that happened when something moved from the category of assessed unknown into the category of assessed known. The lion had not stopped being aware of him. He had begun to include him in his world rather than monitoring him against it. This was, Can thought, a different and better category to occupy. He continued. He came every morning. He brought nothing. He watched with the genuine attention that Braca had told him living things recognized as real rather than performed, and he did not rush the practice toward any conclusion, and he let it be what it was, which was, at minimum, 14 mornings of sitting in the red rock country of southern Mulgore, in the spring light watching the most complete animal he had ever encountered go about the business of being entirely itself. On the 9th day he saw the lion hunt. He had been watching long enough by then to recognize the specific behavioral shift that preceded the hunt, a gathering of attention that was different from the ordinary attention of territorial watching. A change in the way the body was held that was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you knew the vocabulary. He held completely still and watched. The lion came off the ridge in a movement that was more like the ridge releasing him than him leaving it. No visible decision preceding the motion, simply stillness and then movement, with nothing between the two states that could be identified as transition. He moved through the grass with a silence that seemed impossible for his size, each paw placed with a precision that left the vegetation undisturbed in a way that Can had not previously understood vegetation could be undisturbed by something that large moving through it at that pace. The kill was clean. It was over before Can had fully registered that it had begun. He sat in the grass afterward and thought about what he had seen, the motion itself, the absence of the between, the efficiency that went beyond skill into something that felt like a different relationship with the physics of moving bodies, and began the work of understanding it. This was, he recognized, a different kind of education from anything Braca had given him. Braca had given him technique and knowledge and the fundamentals of how to see. The lion was giving him something that had no name in the vocabulary he had arrived with. On the 14th morning, the lion stood up from his position on the ridge. He stretched with the full, unhurried completeness of a large animal that had slept well and was under no urgency. A long extension of the forelegs, and then the hindquarters, and then a full body shake that settled the coat and the mane back into their resting positions. He looked at the plains. He looked at Can. Then he stepped down from the ridge with the same deliberate precision he brought to all movement, moved through the grass at the base of the formation, and settled into a position 20 yards from where Can was sitting. He looked at the plain from this new position. The distance between them was now 20 yards rather than 30. This had not been announced and was not dramatic. It was simply a choice, made and enacted with the same matter-of-fact completeness with which the lion made all choices, without performance and without any visible awareness that it might be significant to the thing sitting in the grass. Can sat in the spring grass with the red stone formations around him and the lion 20 yards away, and felt something in him settle that had been in motion for a long time. Not completion, it was not complete, whatever this was, but a settling, a sense of being in the right place at the right time doing the right thing, which was rarer and more valuable than he had understood before he had experienced it. He packed his camp the following morning with the deliberate attention of someone making a decision as much as an action. He checked the gun's mechanism and loaded it and slung it. He shouldered his pack and checked its distribution of weight. He looked at the ridge, the place where the planestrider had been, where the stone caught the morning light in the specific way he had been watching for 14 days, and fixed the image with the care of someone fixing something they would return to in memory when the road required it. Then he turned north and walked. He had gone perhaps 100 yards when he became aware of the presence behind him. Not through hearing, the lion moved with the silence that had been part of his education, the paws finding the terrain without sound. Not through sight, he had not looked back. He became aware of it the way he became aware of things that were present, but not announcing themselves. Through the behavior of the world around him, the small birds in the scrub ahead adjusting their routine with the minor, unhurried adjustment of things accounting for something large moving in their vicinity, the air against the back of his neck, carrying information that did not arrive through any single identifiable channel. He walked another quarter mile. Then he stopped, ostensibly to consult his mother's leather map. In the natural process of unfolding it, he turned his body at the angle that allowed him to see, at the edge of his peripheral vision, the grass behind him. The lion was sitting in the grass 25 yards back, watching Can with the same level, unhurried attention he brought to all things. He showed no intention of moving and no intention of retreating. He was present, in the position he had chosen, at the distance he had decided was appropriate, with the absolute ease of something that had made a decision, and was being the decision rather than announcing it. Can looked at the map for a moment. He looked at the road ahead. He folded the map and replaced it in his pack. He continued walking. The lion followed. The days of travel that followed had a feel Can had no prior framework for. The lion maintained his chosen distance, sometimes 25 yards, sometimes 30, occasionally as close as 15 when the terrain narrowed or the wind shifted in ways that made closer proximity practical. He never came alongside in those first days, never initiated contact. But he was there, always there, the presence at the edge of Khan's awareness that was simultaneously the most significant thing in his immediate world and the most natural feeling, as if the arrangement had been established long before either of them had arrived at the decision, and was only now being made visible. They hunted separately. The lion disappeared into the terrain at intervals and returned, sometimes with evidence of having fed and sometimes without, and Khan hunted with his gun when opportunity presented itself and processed the kills in the evenings with the methodical care his mother had taught him. They did not share food. They shared a fire after the third night, the lion settling himself at the fire's boundary on that evening as if he had been doing it for years, his great head resting on his paws, his amber eyes catching the orange light, his breathing slow and completely relaxed. Khan sat across the fire from the most complete animal he had ever encountered and felt, not happiness in the simple sense, not triumph or accomplishment, the particular feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, in the company of exactly the right thing. He had felt something adjacent to this before. At the river in the early morning, certain mornings when the water was particularly clear, and the fish were where he had predicted, and the light was doing what the light did on its best days. But this was something larger and more fundamental, the feeling of a thing that had been pointing in a direction, finally seeing what it had been pointing toward. He did not romanticize it. He noted it with the same care he gave all accurate observations, and filed it in the interior arrangement he maintained for things worth keeping. By the time the first clear view of Thunder Bluff appeared on the horizon, the mesa rising from the Mulgore Plain with an authority that made every other elevation in the landscape look provisional, the structures at the summit just barely visible at this distance, the sheer fact of it undeniable, the lion had been walking with him for 11 days. Khan stopped on the road and looked at the mesa for a long moment. He felt the size of what was ahead, the city on the cliff, the hunters who would have questions, the weapon masters and the trainers and all the specific knowledge he had come north to acquire. He felt the size of what he was bringing to it. A young hunter from a small settlement, 17 years old, with a broken horn and red eyes and a gun that was still learning to be fully his. And behind him, 25 yards back, sitting in the morning grass and regarding Thunder Bluff with the same level amber assessment, he brought to all things requiring an opinion, the most complete animal in the red rock country of southern Mulgore, who had chosen to be here, who had decided, for reasons that were entirely his own and would remain entirely his own, that the road north was worth walking. Khan turned back to the road and walked toward Thunder Bluff, and the lion followed, and the spring morning continued being the spring morning, and the world did not remark on any of it, which was exactly right. From the thoughts of Khan Ashwalo.
14 mornings. I will be asked, I expect, by hunters who want to understand the method. I already know what I will tell them, which is the truth. I did not make anything happen. I was present in a specific way across a specific duration, and the lion made a decision about what my presence was and what it was worth, and the decision he arrived at was sufficient for him to extend his world to include me. Sufficient. Not compelling. Not overwhelming. Sufficient. I keep returning to the gap between sufficient and compelling. A compelling case for trust is still an argument. It is still trying to produce a specific outcome, which means it is still, at some level, about the person making the case rather than the creature being asked to trust. Sufficient trust is different. Sufficient trust is what grows when you are consistently what you are without agenda for long enough, that the other thing has enough data to make an honest assessment. He made an honest assessment. He found me sufficient. I am responsible now for remaining what he found sufficient. Not performing it. Being it. This is, I think, the actual content of the covenant, not the dramatic moment of choosing, which is what people ask about, but the ordinary daily work of being the thing that justified the choice. Every morning, without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement. Tama, I've been carrying what she said at the river for 11 days now, in the way you carry things that are too significant to put down and too unresolved to put away. She said it and released me from it in the same breath, which required more courage than most things I have witnessed anyone do. And I have been thinking about what it means that she found that courage and used it rather than defaulting to the easier silence. I said her name. She said that was enough. I have been wondering since whether it was enough for her or whether she told me it was enough because she knew I could not do better and wanted to give me the truth without making me feel inadequate to it. I suspect the latter. I suspect she knew exactly what she was doing and did it deliberately, which is the most Tama thing I can imagine. I do not have adequate words for what I feel about Tama. I have tried to find them on these 11 nights at the fire, and have found instead that the feeling is larger than any of the words I have available for it. This is not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. I am learning to hold it. Graswan said a scout heading east, carrying dispatches, cheerful, continuing east in the morning. This is the shape of a person who expected to return, who did not know what was coming on the eastern road, who sat at a fire and ate and slept and continued into something that did not return him. The crossroads. That is the next place I need to ask. Can Ashwalo